They put a collar on me and called it a crown. I was standing in the grand reception hall of the HFY Imperial Palace when I first understood what they truly thought of me. The hall was enormous, built from pale stone that hummed with bioluminescent veins running through it like rivers. Seen from the sky, the light it gave off was cool, almost blue, and it made every surface look alive. The HFY were tall, most of them over 2 m, with elongated limbs and skin that shifted between silver and deep violet depending on their mood and rank. They moved the way royalty always moves, slowly, like the room belongs to them and always has. I am Elias Grant. I am 5'11" in tall, with brown hair going gray at the temples, a face that people forget within 10 minutes of meeting me, and hands that look like they belong to a man who fixes pipes for a living. That was not an accident. The Terran Confederacy chose me for exactly those reasons. The ceasefire had been signed 6 weeks earlier. 12 million people were dead from the border conflict, most of them on our side. The HFY had not lost much in comparison. They never did. They were older, stronger, and more advanced, and everyone in the known galaxy knew it. When they offered peace terms the Confederacy accepted before the ink was dry, and when those terms included a political marriage binding a human representative to the Empress here of the Dominion, the Confederacy sent me. I walked down the center aisle of that hall with 400 Cathar nobles watching on both sides. They were dressed in layered ceremonial robes, the colors of deep-sea water, and their collective bioluminescence made the air between them shimmer. They did not clap. They did not cheer. A few leaned toward each other and whispered. I heard none of it clearly, but I did not need to. The shape of contempt is the same in every language. Empress here Sever stood at the far end of the hall on a raised dais. She was tall even for a HFY, nearly 2.5 meters, with skin that shimmered between silver and a deep, rich purple. Her face was angular and still, the kind of stillness that comes from years of practice, not from peace. She wore a crown of woven bioluminescent fibers and a robe that trailed behind her for 6 m. She was extraordinary to look at. She did not look at me once during the entire walk to the dais. The ceremony was conducted by a Cathara elder whose name translated roughly to Keeper of the Long Accord. He read the peace terms aloud in both Keitha and a translation so mechanical it barely counted as language. When he reached the section binding me as the Confederacy's representative consort to the Empress, here several nobles near the front made a sound I had not heard before. My translator chip in my left ear rendered it as polite amusement. I stood straight. I kept my hand still. I said the required words when prompted. Sever said hers without once turning her head fully in my direction. Her voice was low and steady, and even through the translator chip, the sound of it was striking. She spoke the words of binding the way someone reads a maintenance report. When it was done, her chief advisor stepped forward. His name was Lord Cassith. He was broad for a Cathara, with dark indigo skin and eyes that were the pale yellow of old bone. He handed me a secondary robe, thin and ceremonial, and helped drape it over my shoulders with the precise, deliberate care of a man placing a leash. He met my eyes for one moment and did not blink. I smiled at him. Nothing in his expression changed. The reception that followed lasted 3 hours. I stood near Sever, who said 4 words to me in that entire Time, do not wander off. I did not wander off. I stood and I watched. Because watching was why I was there. I counted 17 distinct noble houses by their crest colors alone. I identified 3 separate conversations that stopped immediately when I came within earshot. I watched the way different advisors angled themselves toward or away from Cassith when he moved through the room, and I built a rough map of the political gravity in that hall, who orbited him, who stepped back, who watched him from across the room with an expression that had no warmth in it at all. I ate the food that was placed in front of me, which tasted like salted mineral water and something close to citrus. I drank the liquid they offered, which was safe for humans according to the medical briefing I had received, and which tasted like nothing at all. I nodded when nodded to. I did not speak unless spoken to, and I was not spoken to. A noble near the far end of the room, young by Cathara standards, and with the bright teal shimmer of the outer houses, leaned toward the elder beside him and said something that my translator Chip caught at the edge of its range. The peace pet, he said it with the bored confidence of someone who does not believe he can be overheard. I noted which house crest he wore. I noted which table he returned to. I noted who laughed with him. At the end of the reception, I was escorted to my quarters by 2 palace guards named, according to the roster I had been given, VTH and Orth. The quarters were at the northern end of the residential wing, 3 floors above ground level, and they were modest by palace standards, which still made them considerably larger than any apartment I had lived in. The walls were that same pale glowing stone. The furniture was Cathara in scale, which meant most of it was too tall for me to use comfortably. Someone had placed a human sail chair near the window. It was a small gesture, and I did not know if it came from Sever, from a functionary following a protocol, or from no one in particular. I stood at the window for a long time after the guards left. The palace grounds stretched below me, lit in layers by the ambient bioluminescence of the stone itself, by the garden cultivars glowing soft green along the paths, and by the patrol routes of the outer guard, whose armor caught the light and threw it back in moving fragments. I counted the patrol intervals. I noted the gap in the sensor coverage along the north-facing corridor that connected my wing to the service passages. It was not a large gap, about 11 seconds at the outside, and it existed because the sensor array on that corridor was designed for Cathara movement patterns, which were slower and longer strided than mine. I did not plan to use it for anything, not yet. I filed it away the same way I filed away everything else I had seen that evening, carefully, without attachment, without urgency. The Confederacy had given me one instruction above all others when they selected me for this assignment. It was not a tactical instruction. It was not a strategic framework. It was 7 words spoken to me by the Director of External Affairs herself in a briefing room on Earth with the door closed and the recording system switched off. She had looked at me across the table and said, "Do not let them know what you are." I had asked what specifically she meant by that. She had said, "Everything." I looked out at the glowing palace grounds, at the alien sky above them with its 3 visible moons and its unfamiliar constellations, and I thought about those 7 words. They thought they had bought a hostage. They had bought a front row seat. 3 months. That was how long it took before they Dominion stopped watching me every moment of every day, not because they trusted me. The Cathara did not operate on trust, not with outsiders, not with each other. They stopped watching me with their full attention because I gave them nothing worth watching. I attended every ceremonial function I was required to attend. I stood where I was placed, and I sat when I was directed to sit. I signed the documents that were put in front of me, most of which were formalities so minor they would have been handled by a junior clerk in any functioning government. I ate my meals in the small adjoining dining room attached to my quarters, usually alone, occasionally with a rotation of palace officials who had been assigned the polite fiction of socializing with the consort of the Empress here. Those officials were without exception from lower-ranking houses. They were courteous in the mechanical way that protocol demands and incurious the way that people are when they are also slightly repelled by the thing they are curious about. They ask me questions about Earth, about human biology, about whether it was true that humans slept for 8 consecutive hours every night, and whether that felt from the inside like a small death. I answered everything honestly and without drama. Yes, we sleep roughly a third of our lives. No, it does not feel like dying. It feels like nothing at all, and that is part of why it works. They found this unsettling. I had noticed that the Cathara, who entered only a shallow rest cycle for 2 to 3 hours in every 24, considered prolonged unconsciousness to be something between a vulnerability and a character flaw. The fact that humans had evolved to go completely dark for a third of every day and had still managed to build a starfaring civilization was the kind of information that landed differently depending on how you heard it. I let it land however it wanted to land. I was not there to impress anyone, not yet. The work I was actually doing was invisible, which was precisely the point. I was learning the palace the way water learns a landscape, slowly and without force, filling in every low point and narrow channel. I learned the names of the guards on every rotation. I learned which servants were assigned to which nobles and which of those servants were also reporting to which faction. I learned the acoustic properties of the main corridor outside my wing, which carried whispered conversations further than anyone who had not specifically tested it would expect. I learned severally, not at first from a distance, through the geometry of how a court moves around its center. She was present at every formal occasion and absent from every informal one. She spoke in full, precise sentences and never repeated herself. She consulted Cassith before major announcements and after them, but not during, which told me she was still deciding whether to trust him or simply had not yet found a reason to stop. She had a personal guard of 6, led by captain named Tova, who was younger than the others and moved differently from them, not with the practiced smoothness of ceremony, but with the flat readiness of someone who had actually been in situations where readiness mattered. I made a point of nodding to Tova whenever I passed her in the corridor, not speaking, just acknowledging. She did not respond for the first 3 weeks. Then one morning, she gave a very slight nod back. It was the size of a gesture that meant nothing. I filed it away. The moment that changed things came during the 4th week of the 2nd month, and it had nothing to do with politics. A supply convoy that was supposed to deliver medical and logistical materials to 2 of the Dominion's outer colonies, had been sitting in administrative suspension for 11 days. The problem was a jurisdictional overlap between 3 separate Dominion bureaucratic bodies, each of which had issued conflicting authorization codes for the same cargo. Manifest, which meant that by Cathara administrative law, the convoy could not legally depart until the conflict was resolved, which required a formal arbitration hearing, which required the submission of a proper petition, which required a counter-signature from a ranking official who was currently on a diplomatic mission to the outer systems. 11 days people were waiting for medicine. I found out about it because one of the junior officials who dined with mentioned it as an example of the frustrations of bureaucratic life in the Dominion, the way people mention frustrations they have given up on solving. He was not asking me for anything, he was making conversation. I spent 2 hours after dinner going through the administrative code texts that were available on the Palace information network, which my access level permitted me to read but not edit. The solution was not elegant, it was not clever, it was simply a matter of reading the 3 conflicting codes side by side and noticing that 2 of them had an exemption clause allowing a ranking diplomatic representative to issue a temporary bridge authorization in cases of humanitarian necessity, provided the authorization was countersigned by any certified Dominion official of rank 4 or above. I was a ranking diplomatic representative, the junior official who had told me about the problem was rank 5. I drafted the bridge authorization that evening, looked up the correct form, filled it in properly, and brought it to the junior official the following morning at breakfast with a brief explanation of the legal pathway it used. He stared at it for a long time. The convoy departed that afternoon. I did not tell anyone I had done it. I did not need to. In a palace, everything that happens becomes known. The question is only how it becomes known and what shape it takes. By the time it arrives in the right ears, what arrived in Sever's ears, I learned later, was not the story of a clever human finding a loophole. It was a smaller and stranger story. The human consort had fixed a problem that had been sitting on the desk of 3 separate departments for 11 days, and he had done it in an evening, and he had handed the solution to a junior official and walked away without mentioning it to anyone. The walked away without mentioning it part was apparently the part that landed. Cassith's reaction was different. He said nothing publicly, but in the week that followed, 2 of the officials who regularly dined with me were quietly reassigned to duties in other parts of the palace. This was not a coincidence. In Cassith's political vocabulary, removing the audience was the first step before removing the performer. I noted it without alarm. He was moving to isolate me, which was a sensible move if he believed I was a threat, and an unnecessary one if he believed I was harmless. The fact that he was doing it told me he had already revised his assessment. Good. An opponent who underestimates you is dangerous. An opponent who is paying attention is manageable. You know where they are looking. The dinner where things shifted between Sever and me was unremarkable in its setting. A small, formal meal, 8 attendees, second-tier nobles and their advisors. I was placed at the far end of the table from her as usual. Cath was at her right hand. As usual, midway through the meal, one of the nobles made a point about the Confederacy's economic output in a way that was technically accurate but structured to imply that human civilization was a resource-poor, low-year-old yield civilization barely worth the diplomatic overhead, he said. It pleasantly, he said it in the tone of someone making an observation rather than a provocation. I looked down the table at Kath while the noble was speaking. Cassith was watching me, not the noble me. He wanted to see how I responded to being diminished in front of my own consort. I turned to the noble and agreed with him. I said that yes, by several conventional economic metrics, the Confederacy's output did appear modest relative to the Dominion. I then mentioned conversationally 3 of those metrics by name and explained precisely why each of them had been developed by Kithra economic theorists to measure productivity in civilizations with Kithra biological lifespans and why applying them to a civilization with a human lifespan of 80 years produced a systematic undercount of roughly 40% due to generational turnover rates creating different capital accumulation patterns. I said this pleasantly. I said it the way someone makes an observation rather than a provocation. The noble blinked. He began to say something and then did not. Cassith's luminescence shifted for just a moment. A flicker of something darker. I looked back at my food and said nothing else for the rest of the dinner. Afterward, walking back to my wing, I became aware that Sever had fallen into step a short distance behind me. I did not turn around. I kept walking at my normal pace. She said quietly in Cathara, "Why did you say that?" My translator rendered it immediately by replied in the same language which I had been studying since before my departure from Earth. My grammar was imperfect and she would know it. I said it anyway, because it was accurate. I said, a pause, our footsteps in the empty corridor. You could have said nothing. Yes, I agreed. Another pause, longer. Why did you not? She said. I stopped walking and turned to face her. She was 2 m away, tall and still, her skin a deep silver in the low light of the corridor. Her expression was the same, careful, neutral it always was, but she had asked because inaccuracy compounds. I said a wrong measurement taken once is a mistake. Wrong measurement accepted as standard becomes a foundation. I did not want your court building foundations on measurements designed for someone else. She looked at me for a long time, not with warmth, not yet, but with something I had not seen from her before. She turned and walked away without another word. I stood in the corridor for a moment after she was gone. Then I walked back to my quarters, sat down in the human scale chair by the window, and looked out at the 3 moons in the glowing gardens below. Tova was at her guard post at the end of the corridor. As I passed her door, she did not nod. This time, she looked at me directly, briefly, and said one word in Keith. The translator rendered it as careful. I was not sure if it was a warning or advice. I decided it was both. I thanked her quietly and kept walking. 2 days later, Cassith moved his first serious piece. I found out about it the way I found out about most things in the palace, not through any formal channel, but through the accumulation of small wrong details. A guard rotation that was 2 minutes early, a senior archivist who arrived at the records hall before it opened and left 10 minutes after Cassith's chief aide had departed through the side entrance. A supply order for the outer eastern wing which was used only for overflow housing during large diplomatic gatherings filed 3 days before any gathering had been announced. None of these things individually meant anything. Together in sequence they formed a shape in the Terran Confederacy's Intelligence Division, where I had spent 11 years before moving into strategic advisory work. We had a word for this kind of reading. We called it reading the ground, not the map, not the intelligence briefings, not the classified intercepts, the ground, the actual physical and behavioral landscape of a place. Read the way a traveler reads weather, not by looking at a forecast, but by watching how animals are moving and which way the wind is carrying smell. The ground was telling me that something was being prepared in the eastern wing, that records were being accessed or altered, and that the timing aligned with a formal reception scheduled in 6 days at which 4 of the outer noble houses would be present, along with their security delegations. I sat with this for 24 hours and let the shape become clearer. By the end of the second day, I was reasonably certain what Cassith was planning. It was technically elegant, a manufactured crisis during the reception, an apparent threat to sever, serious enough to require a response but controlled enough not to cause real harm. The blame would fall on one of the outer houses, specifically the one whose young noble had made the careless comment about the peace pet at my wedding reception. That house had been in a quiet territorial dispute with Cassith's faction for 2 years, discrediting them publicly during a diplomatic event with witnesses from multiple houses would consolidate Cassith's position significantly. The plan had 7 identifiable pressure points. I told exactly one person. Tova was at her rotation post at the end of the residential corridor at the 4th hour of the morning watch, which was the quietest hour in the palace and the one where the guard complement was at its lowest. I walked to her post and stood beside her for a moment without speaking. She did not reach for her weapon. She watched me. I spoke quietly in Cathera, and I told her what I believed was being planned. I did not tell her everything I knew. I told her the parts that were relevant to protecting Sever. I told her the timing, the location, and the 3 most likely methods through which the apparent threat would be delivered. I told her the pressure points and which ones I intended to address myself. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said, "How do you know this?" I said, "The same way anyone knows anything." I paid attention. She looked at me with an expression I was not certain I could read accurately. Then she said, "If you are wrong, this ends badly for you." I said, "I know." She said, "If you are right, this ends badly for Cassith." I said, "I know." She thought about it for another moment. Then she gave one short nod. We did not speak again that night. The 6 days before the reception were the longest of my time in the palace, not because I was afraid, though I was in the way that anyone with good judgment is afraid when they are working against a well-resourced opponent in unfamiliar territory. I was afraid the way surgeon is afraid before a difficult procedure, not paralyzed but sharpened. I used those 6 days to address the pressure points one at a time. The first was the records that had been accessed in the archive. I could not alter them, but I could flag the access. I filed a routine administrative query through my diplomatic access, citing a requirement for historical precedent documents related to the peace treaty which required the archive to log a formal access record for the dates in question. This meant that any attempt to claim the records had not been accessed would be contradicted by the official log. The second pressure point was the supply order for the Eastern Wing. I found a Cathara procedural regulation requiring that supply orders for wings designated as overflow housing be countersigned by the Palace Facilities Coordinator when filed in advance of an unannounced event. The order had not been countersigned. I sent a polite administrative note to the Facilities Coordinator pointing out the oversight. The order was suspended pending review. The third pressure point was the guard rotation irregularity. I could not address this directly without revealing what I knew, so instead I addressed it indirectly. I submitted a formal request through the correct diplomatic channels to observe the reception security arrangements as part of my consort duties, citing a Terran diplomatic protocol requiring spousal representatives to be briefed on security measures at formal events. This request was technically valid under the terms of the marriage agreement. It required the Palace Security Office to review and document its own security plan for the event, which meant any last-minute changes would be visible on record. The 4th, 5th, and 6th pressure points were subtler, and addressing them required using relationships I had built over the previous months, small and careful deposits now being drawn on for the first time. A senior servant, a junior records official, a member of the outer house who had no connection to Cassith's faction and who I had spoken to precisely once 3 weeks prior about nothing important, but who had seemed to me like someone who would rather know a thing than not know it. I did not tell any of them the full picture. I gave each of them one piece, the piece most relevant to their position and most likely to cause them to behave in ways that would collectively make the false crisis impossible to execute cleanly. The 7th pressure point I addressed myself directly on the evening of the reception. The reception was held in the grand outer courtyard, a large open space with the bioluminescent stone walls rising on 3 sides in the night sky. Above 400 guests, 12 security delegations. The lighting was soft and ambient and came from everywhere at once. I spent the first hour of the reception moving through the crowd, slowly stopping to exchange brief words with people I recognized, never lingering, never hurrying. I was doing what I always did at these events, being unremarkable, except that tonight I was unremarkable in specific locations at specific times. At 42 minutes into the reception, I was standing in the service corridor adjacent to the eastern courtyard wall when Cassith's aide passed through it carrying a small sealed container. The aide did not see me because I was standing in the section of the corridor where the sensor coverage had the 11-second gap I had noted on my first night in the palace. I had spent 3 months learning exactly where that gap was and how to stand in it. I stepped out of the gap and into the aide's path. He stopped. He stared at me. Container was in his hands. I looked at it and then at him and said, "Imperfect. Cathara, the facilities coordinator, has a flag on everything that entered the Eastern Wing this week. Anything used here tonight will be traceable in under an hour. The record's access from 8 days ago has already been logged. The guard rotation irregularity from 3 days ago is in the security review that was Filed this afternoon. I watched him. Understand, then I said whatever is in that container, it would be a very good night to take it somewhere else. He left. He did not run. He walked quickly back the way he had come, and I heard the side door open and close. I went back to the reception. Cass's manufactured crisis did not materialize. The reception passed without incident. Outer houses departed at the end of the evening with no damage done to their standing. Sever said her formal closing words and withdrew. By midnight, whispers had begun circulating among the noble houses, the specific careful kind of whispers that Cath could not trace back to any single source, that something had been planned and had failed. No one knew the details. No one could point to a culprit. Cath knew. He did not say so publicly because saying so would require explaining what he had planned and why it had not worked. In the architecture of court politics that was worse than silence, I was in my quarters when I heard the knock at the door, not a guard's knock, formal and two beat, a single quiet knock. I opened the door. Sever stood in the corridor. No attendants, no ceremonial robe. She was wearing the plain secondary garments I had not seen her in before, and she looked for just a moment like a person rather than a position. She said, "You knew?" I said. She said, "Before it happened." I said, 3 days before. She was quiet. "Then why did you not come to me?" I said, "Because you would have been required to act through official channels, and official channels have leaks, and the plan would have changed rather than collapsed." Her luminescence was steady, a deep silver, unreadable. "The Cathara elder at the dinner last month," she said. "The old texts. Did you hear what he said about your people?" I said I had. "The patient ones," she said. I did not reply. She looked at me for a long moment, not with warmth, not quite, but with the particular attention of someone who has realized they have been looking at a thing incorrectly and is now trying to see it properly. She said, "This does not make us even." I said, "I did not do it to make us even." She turned to go, then she stopped. She did not turn back when she spoke. She said, "Casseth will not forget this." I said, "I know," she said, "neither will I." Then she walked away down the corridor, and I stood in my doorway and watched the empty space where she had been for a moment before I closed the vault door. I sat in the chair by the window. The 3 moons were high and bright. The garden paths below glowed their soft green. I thought about Casseth, who was intelligent and positioned, and now very angry. Anger in intelligent people with resources is dangerous, but it is also predictable. Angry people move faster than they should and communicate more than they intend. I thought about the shape of what would come next. He would not move directly. He would wait a few weeks to let the failure settle, and then he would do what anyone in his position would do when subtle action had failed. He would reach for something larger. I thought about that for a while. Then I went to bed. The move came 19 days later, and it was not what I had expected. I had modeled 7 possible actions Casseth might take. I had ranked them by probability, by resource cost, by the degree of political risk each carried, and by the damage each could do. I had been thorough. I had, I believed, been comprehensive. I had not modeled the one he chose because it required him to surrender something he had protected for years. It required him to sacrifice position in order to destroy. That is the kind of move that rational analysis misses because it depends on emotional escalation overriding strategic Self-interest, Cassith had always been. Strategic, the failure at the reception had changed something in him. What he did was this: he went to the Imperial Military Council and told them that I was not a diplomat. He told them with documentation he had spent the better part of 2 months quietly assembling, that I was a covert strategic analyst with 11 years in the Confederacy's Intelligence Division, that my selection as the consort representative was not an accident but an operation, that the marriage itself had been a deliberate placement of an intelligence asset at the heart of the Dominion's ruling family, and that everything I had done in the palace since my arrival, every small service, every quiet intervention, every unremarkable evening in my quarters was part of a long-running human intelligence operation targeting the Dominion's political structure. The documentation was accurate, every piece of it was real. I want to be clear about that. Cassith did not fabricate evidence. He found it, and what he found was true. I had worked in intelligence. I had been selected in part because of that background. The Confederacy had not sent a harmless diplomat. They had sent someone who knew what they were doing. The council convened an emergency session within 4 hours of receiving Cassith's submission. Sever was notified and told to stand aside pending review, which was a legal mechanism the council had not used in 30 years and which placed her in an uncomfortable constitutional position. She could neither endorse nor oppose the proceeding without it being read as political interference. Cassith knew this. It was the part of his plan that was genuinely clever. I was collected from my quarters by 6 PAL security officers at the second hour of the morning watch. They were formal and correct and did not touch me. I walked with them to the council chambers in the East Administrative Wing, a part of the palace I had not been to before, and was taken into a room with 9 council members seated along a curved bench of that same pale glowing stone in a single chair in the center of the floor facing them. I sat in the chair. The chair was a Cathara standard chair, which meant it was too tall for me, and my feet did not reach the floor. I sat in it anyway and held my posture straight. I was not going to ask for a different chair. The senior council member, an elderly Cathara whose luminescence had faded to a dull silver white that you see only the very old, read the charges aloud. Deceptive placement, intelligence, infiltration of the diplomatic compact. Terms. He asked me to respond. I said, everything you have been told is accurate. The room was very quiet. The senior council member looked at me. His expression did not change. He said, you admit to the charges. I said, I am acknowledging facts. Whether they constitute the charges as framed is a different question. A younger council member to the left said, you were placed here as a spy. I said, I was placed here as a strategic analyst who is also a diplomatic representative. Both things are true. The Confederacy selected me because I have relevant skills. That is what any government does when selecting a representative for a high-stakes placement. The relevant skills, the young council member said, are intelligence skills. Yes, I said, they are also the skills that prevented a fabricated crisis from destabilizing your Empress Hare's reception 19 days ago, and the skills that resolved a convoy authorization deadlock that 3 of your own administrative bodies had failed to address for 11 days. Skills are the same skills regardless of how you categorize them. Cassith was seated in the observer's gallery to my right. I had not looked at him since entering the room. I looked at him now. He was watching me with an expression of focused attention, waiting for something. He wanted me to argue innocence. He wanted me to deny the documentation, to claim it was fabricated, to perform the kind of defensive scramble that would confirm to everyone watching that I was caught and afraid. I turned back to the counsel. I said, I would like to offer you something more useful than a defense. The senior council member said, speak. I said, I would like to tell you what the Terran Confederacy actually is. The room was quiet again, a different kind of quiet. This time, I looked at the 9 faces in front of me, and I spoke clearly and without hurry. I told them about Earth. Not the tourism version, not the diplomatic version, the real version. I told them about the 7 mass extinction events in our geological record, 2 of them partial, 5 of them severe, the last of which had occurred 45,000 years before our earliest written records and had reduced the human population to fewer than 10,000 individuals. I told them about the diseases that had killed 1/3 of our population in single decades. The ones we had cured, the ones that had returned, the ones we had inadvertently created and then solved. I told them about the 3 separate periods in our recorded history when our own technology had nearly destroyed us, and about how we had responded each time, not by retreating from the technology, but by developing the capacity to survive it. I told them about what human psychology looks like when it is under maximum pressure. I was precise about this. I told them what happens to human cognitive function under sustained threat, under resource deprivation, under the kind of collective trauma that would have, by every model we had studied in other species, produced civilizational collapse. I told them what happened. Instead, I said, we do not collapse cleanly. This is not a boast. It is a description of a mechanism when a human civilization is brought to a point that should end it. It does not end. It fractures, it contracts, it enters periods of darkness that can last generations, and then it begins again. Not the same way, not from the same foundation, from whatever is left. We have done this so many times that it is no longer an accident. It is a characteristic. I could see some of the council members shifting in their seats. Not uncomfortably, exactly more the way someone shifts when a conversation has moved into territory they had not expected. I said, the Cathara Dominion is older than the Confederacy by several thousand years. You are more advanced by most measures. In a direct conflict of sufficient scale, you would win. This is not a question, but a direct conflict of sufficient scale is not the only kind of conflict that exists. The senior council member said, you are describing a threat. I said, I am describing a reality. A threat is when someone tells you what they will do to you. I am telling you what we are. There is a difference. The young council member said, what is the difference? Practically, I said, a threat requires a choice. A description of reality requires a decision. Cassith spoke for the first time from the observer and LT, UNC and GT gallery. His voice was controlled but thin. He said, the human is performing. This is what intelligence operatives do. When they are caught, they reframe the conversation. I looked at him. I said, Lord Cassith, you have been trying to reframe conversations in this palace for The entire duration of my time here, I am telling the council the truth. I understand that distinction may be difficult from your current position. Several council members looked at Cassith. He said nothing further. I turned back to the senior council member, and I said, I will answer every question you have completely, and honestly, I have no interest in deception at this stage. Deception has a time and a place, and this is not it. This is the point where clarity becomes the only thing worth offering. Interrogation lasted 4 more hours. They asked me about the Confederacy's military capability, about our intelligence services, about my specific mission parameters, about the other humans who had been positioned in diplomatic roles across the Dominion sphere. I answered everything, not everything I knew, but everything they asked. There is a difference between honesty and disclosure, and I had been trained to understand the boundary very well. At some point during the 3rd hour, I became aware that someone had entered the small observation room behind the one-way panel on the western wall. I did not look at it directly. I noted it in my peripheral awareness, the way you note a change in light. I knew who it was. The senior council member said near the end of the session, if we were to act against you now, what would the Confederacy's response be? I said, I do not know the specific response. I know that the Confederacy's standing instruction in cases where a diplomatic representative is harmed under treaty covered placement is to treat it as a treaty violation and respond through the full range of available options. He said, full range? I said, yes. He said, that is a broad phrase. I said, the Confederacy uses it intentionally. Specificity and deterrence reduces options. Bread preserved them. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, you are a very unusual being, Elias Grant. I said, we are an unusual species. That is more or less the point. He closed the session. The council members withdrew for deliberation. I sat in the center of the floor in the chair that was too tall for me and waited. After 20 minutes, the door of the observation room opened and Sever walked in, not through the formal entrance, through the side door, directly into the interrogation chamber. Without any attendants and without any ceremony, she stood 6 ft from me. I did not stand up, not because I was making a point, but because I was genuinely tired and my back was beginning to hurt from 3 hours in a chair that was not designed for my proportions. She looked at me the way she had looked at me in the corridor after the failed reception. That same searching look that was trying to recalibrate something. She said, was any of it real? I said, all of it. The convoy, the reception, everything. I said to you in the corridor, the translation argument at dinner, all of it was exactly what it appeared to be. She said, but you were also doing the other thing. I said, I was also doing the other thing. Both were real. People are allowed to be more than one thing simultaneously. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, what do you actually want from this marriage? I said, a peace that does not end the moment someone finds it inconvenient. She said, and what does that look like? I said, I genuinely do not know. Yet that is a longer conversation. She looked at me for another moment. Then, for the first time since I had arrived in this palace, she pulled a chair from the side of the room, a Keith chair, too tall for me and apparently also slightly uncomfortable for her at this angle, and she sat down across from me. Not above me, not at a distance chosen to remind me of the difference in our positions. Across from me, she said. Then we should start having it. Council deliberated for 11 hours. I spent those hours in an ant room, adjacent to the council chambers, with a cup of something warm that tasted vaguely like mint and a window that looked out over the administrative gardens, which were less dramatic than the main palace grounds, but had a quiet, organized beauty to them that I had not expected. Tova came to check on me twice. She did not say anything either time. The second time she left a small flat piece of cathara bread on the table beside my cup without comment and walked back to her post. I ate it. It tasted like almost nothing, the way great deal of cathara food tasted to me. But I was grateful for it. Outside the council chambers, the palace was going through one of those silent upheavals that looked from the outside like nothing at all. No shouting, no visible disorder, just the careful, rapid repositioning of people who had spent months or years betting on a particular outcome and were now recalculating. Cassith's faction had gone quiet, not the quiet of confidence, the quiet of people waiting to see which way the current was moving before deciding whether to swim or hold still. Several of the mid-tier noble houses that had been loosely aligned with his faction had already sent small signals, the kind of signals that courts use when they want to shift position without admitting they had a position. A scheduled meeting, quietly rescheduled, an aide reassigned to a less visible post, a message of inquiry sent to a neutral house rather than to Cassith's office. Cassith himself made his last move at the 8th hour of the council deliberation. He went to the public gallery of the administrative record hall and filed a formal declaration of constitutional crisis, citing the council's failure to take decisive action and calling in writing for the suspension of the peace treaty on grounds of Confederacy bad faith. The declaration was legally procedural and required a formal response from the council within 48 hours, which meant that even if the council ruled in my favor, they would still be required to spend the next 2 days responding to a crisis declaration that kept his accusation in the official record. It was the move of someone who had accepted that they were losing and wanted to ensure that losing cost the other side something too. It was in its way admirable. Sever dissolved it in 20 minutes. She invoked the imperial privilege of emergency constitutional suspension, a power that the Empress here held in reserve and had not been used in 40 years, and she suspended Cassith's declaration pending a formal review that she placed under her own office's jurisdiction. Then she sent a written instruction to the council that the deliberation should proceed without reference to the declaration. After that, she sent a second written instruction to the palace security office instructing them to relieve Cassith of his advisory credentials pending a conduct review. Both instructions arrived at their destinations before Cassith's aides could draft a response. The council issued its ruling at the 11th hour. I was brought back into the chamber to hear it. The senior council member read it aloud in formal cathara, and my translator rendered it in real time. The council found that while my background was not fully disclosed in the original diplomatic compact, the compact's language did not require full background disclosure for consort representatives, only for primary diplomatic envoys. They found that my actions within the palace had not on the available evidence constituted active intelligence operations targeting the Dominion. Security, they found that the most approximate threat to Dominion stability in the period under review had been the actions of Lord Cassith, and they formally referred that matter to the Imperial Conduct Review Body. They released me. I walked back through the palace to my quarters. The corridors were quiet at that hour. The early morning before the palace's daily rhythm had fully resumed. The stone walls glowed their usual soft blue-white. My were the only sound. I passed Tova's post. She was at it, steady and alert as always. She watched me pass. I said in. Thank you, she said. You do not need to thank me. I said I know I wanted to anyway. She looked at me for a moment with that same unreadable expression. Then she said, the Empress here will want to speak with you this morning. I said I expected she would. I went to my quarters and stood at the window for a while. The 3 moons were still up, very low on the horizon now, pale in the early light. The gardens below were quiet. In a few hours the palace would be fully awake, and there would be decisions to make and conversations to have in the long, careful work of building something that might actually last. I thought about what Sever had said in the interrogation room. Then we should start having it. I thought about the senior council member's words. You are a very unusual being. I thought about the Confederacy far away on the other side of the border. We had bled to defend, waiting for a message. I sat down at the desk in my quarters and opened the communication terminal and typed a short encoded message to the Director of External Affairs. She would be expecting something comprehensive and detailed. I kept it brief. Status ongoing, direction promisings, recommend patience. I sent it enclosed the terminal. Then I sat back and looked at the window and the 3 moons going pale in the early light of a sky that was not my sky, but that I had slowly and without drama learned to read. In 2 hours I would meet with Sever. We would sit across from each other in the same room, 2 people from civilizations that had spent years deciding whether to destroy each other, and we would begin the conversation that comes after all the positioning and the maneuvering and the tests of will, the conversation that is just 2 people trying to figure out whether they can trust each other enough to build something neither of them can build alone. It would be slow. It would require patience of a kind that I understood and that she was, I believed, beginning to understand. Outside in the corridor I heard the palace coming awake, the distant sound of the morning changeover in the guard rotation, a door opening somewhere, the first footsteps of the day beginning. I had been called a peace pet, a hostage, an infiltrator, and by one council member who said it with something close to respect, a very unusual being. I was none of those things, or perhaps all of them, in the way that humans tend to be many things at once without finding it contradictory. I was Elias Grant. I had been sent here to secure a peace. I was going to do exactly